Like, picture this, okay? I want you to imagine. Imagine you're in the Renaissance period in Europe, okay? You're there, you're in your house. You look outside the window and you notice a woman stepping into the streets of Strasbourg, and she just starts to dance. No reason, you know, nobody knows why specifically she started to dance. There was no music, there was no event, nothing happening. Camera. Whoa. Hello? What the hell? Anyway, there was no event happening. There was none of that. She just kept on dancing. Her name was Frau Troffea. I'm gonna go with that pronunciation, okay? I don't know if it's like if it's French. I'm pretty sure it's like French. Um, but I'm gonna go with that. I'm gonna say it's close enough. Now, she did eventually stop. She danced for hours and hours and hours until her body gave out from exhaustion, and she collapsed into the floor, rested for a little bit, but then she just stood up and continued to dance again. Now, okay, that's weird. It's interesting. It probably would have stayed as an interesting tale or something like curious that happened in Strasbourg. The thing is that she ended up not dancing alone. As time passed, more people started joining, and like by the end of it, there were literally over 400 men, women, and children that were consumed by this like urge to dance, and they literally danced until they collapsed. Some people danced until they actually died. Okay, these types of events are called dancing manias. They're also known as like choreomania, or some people call it the St.Vitus dance. I'm gonna explain a little bit like the connection between St.Vitus and the dancing manias. But these terms were like used to describe the outbreaks where like people would stop dancing for no apparent reason, and they would just like continue and wouldn't stop. These events weren't isolated to what happened in the 1518 in Strasbourg. There are literally documented examples of events like these, events of mass hysteria happening before. I have a couple over here that I looked at, and in 1374 is documented that in towns along River Rhine, they saw hundreds of people seized by an agonizing compulsion to dance, where they would only stop to eat or rest before continuing for hours and hours on end. In 1237, there are stories of a group of children who danced and leapt for over 12 miles straight. Now, a year later, about 200 people were dancing on a bridge until the bridge collapsed. Some people died. The survivors were taken to a chapel, St.Vitus Chapel, where they eventually recovered. Now, St. Vitus was a Christian martyr from Sicily whose feast days in Germany were celebrated by dancing before his statue. Now, there are people in the past believed that St. Vitus could heal those people that were afflicted with the dancing mania. So when the outbreaks occurred, it made sense, at least to them, that sufferers would end their frenzy in front of like the shrine. Now, there's an interesting book that I found called The Dancing, played by historian John Waller, and it really goes into detail what happened in this event. It also talks about causes in the past and the historical context that was happening around the area, which led to this event, or what could have led to the event, because at the end of the day, we can't be sure that it was a specific cause or not. And it also goes over the aftermath of what happened after the plague. Now, Frau Troffea, right? She was the first person recorded that stepped outside and just started dancing. There's no record of what triggered it. I already told you all. No music, no events. She was literally alone, and there was no ceremony as well. She just like started dancing spontaneously. When she began, she just simply couldn't stop. She took a couple of rests when her body would give out, and then like continue. As days passed and like her condition worsened, she started to amass a little bit of a crowd of people that were just looking at what she was doing, and speculation started to spread. Maybe it was like demons, maybe it was possession, maybe it might have been poison, stuff like that, right? And her body was literally being destroyed. Like her feet were literally being destroyed. You dance for days and days on end, your feet are gonna be bloodied, bruised, and that's how her feet were. Like they were bloody, they were bruised, they were torn, but she just couldn't stop. And when we look at the chronicles, when we look at the stories as well, they describe it as dancing, but they also talk about how her movements were like jerky and erratic, and as her body grew more exhausted, the movement would only become more spontaneous and erratic. Days passed, she kept dancing, and people started to join her. Gets weird. It starts getting weird, okay? People started blaming demons, and other people started talking, maybe it's a holy message, maybe it's stuff like that. There's a chronicle that reads the following, okay? I'm gonna pay attention, guys, pay attention. This is what the chronicle says of the Strasbourg dancing plague of 1518. It says, "There's been a strange epidemic lately going amongst the folk, so that many in their madness began dancing. They kept it up day and night without interruption until they fell unconscious. Many have died of it." So this was going on. It started gathering crowds, and the city council got together. You know, what are we gonna do? What is going on, guys? Like, this isn't normal. This is a little bit strange. Maybe we should do something about it. But strangely enough, that's not the route they took. The council ended up believing that the dancing was actually something good and that it was heavenly. So they should just bring in musicians, clear out the city, and encourage the dancing. They also said it was like hot blood in the brain, and that by dancing it was the only way to like cure it. So yeah, they just brought in musicians, and just imagine that people are literally suffering in agony, feet are bleeding, collapsing, you have people dying, and then the council pays for musicians and urges them to keep going. They didn't expect that it was gonna last for so long. Like, it literally lasted for over a month. By around like late August, early September, the dancing finally stopped. Now, for the causes, was it bad water? Was it spoiled bread? Was it possession? Was it like combination of these things? This is where historians like John Waller start to analyze and see the historical context and all the stuff that was going around together to try to explain what led to this. In an article for the British Psychological Society, don't judge my pronunciation of British, okay? Waller noted that the participants appeared to be in an dissociative trance and in a kind of like altered state, and it led him to like ask the question, okay, how might we explain these epidemics of disassociation, right? I already mentioned some of the possible causes that were spread around at the time, but we also need to understand that Strasbourg was suffering at that time. Europe was literally going through some tough times, okay? They were going through it. They were being hit by floods, plagues, famines, and there are stories about how floods would cause rivers to rise more than like 30 feet, and that it would end up killing animals, destroying the crops. So combine that also with the cooling climate that was happening because of the little ice age in Europe, where you had a drop in the average temperatures, so it caused like failing in harvest. All of this leads to an increase in poverty, hunger, which also induces more stress, more anxiety. You have that uncertainty. You don't know what's gonna happen, if you're gonna have food tomorrow, all of that stuff. That was kind of like the perfect setting for collective hysteria. That's the hardship side of it. but also there's the religious aspect of it, you know. Around that time, early 1500s, a little bit, you know, before that, after that, people were profoundly religious, and like religion wasn't something that was like, it wasn't like optional. It was literally ingrained in their culture, and it was the air they breathe. If somebody convulsed, if there was like a sickness happening, if there was a seizure or stuff like that, or if weird stuff were happening, it wasn't possession. If like the food was scarce, if like the crops failed, it was God's anger. And when your world literally tells you that spirits can take hold of your body, your mind kind of like learns to believe it. Right, like across cultures, we have studies that show that belief in possession makes people more prone to these trance-like states. So it's kind of like the mind follows those ideas that it's taught. Now, you also need to understand that medicine back then was pretty primitive, and when stuff like this happened, when like you had cases of epilepsy, schizophrenia, severe stress, they were like misreported as a kind of like possession or like demonic influence. So when also people started to dance uncontrollably, they linked it to like something spiritual, not necessarily physical. And this is where like the power of suggestion kicks in, where the more people joined and the more people would keep dancing, the more convincing that illusion became, until like by the end, hundreds of people were caught in that same fevered rhythm. Now, let's look at the aftermath, right? Because you know the events happened, the council thought it was good, but then afterwards they kind of did a 180. They said, "Oh, hold on, maybe it's a little bit weird. Maybe it's a little bit strange that this was happening." So the council stepped in, and they ended up declaring that the dancing was a form of madness. They started banning public dancing, music. They closed dance halls. Street musicians were like restricted and forbidden to play, especially in like holidays and stuff like that. Same thing with like festivals. There were all of that stuff was kind of like became heavily regulated. And the outbreak was also seen as a form of like, or as a sign of like moral decay and divine punishment. So you saw more sermons that warned against vanity, sin, and indulgence, stuff like that. Those that survived the incidents were also taken to the chapel of St.Vitus for like spiritual cleansing. So it's like it's like really interesting when you start going down these rabbit holes of these stories of like mass hysteria. You have these stories of like the dancing plagues, which were common in Europe. You also have stories where there was, I know, I read an incident in a nunnery that happened, that the nuns were like, they began acting like animals, like cats. They started like climbing trees and stuff like that, and it like became, it spread through the nunnery, and it involved a lot of people. So you have all these like interesting stories of stuff that happened in the past. Like, I don't know, it's weird. Listen, history is a little bit weird, it's a little bit peculiar. It's also interesting, and it shows how beliefs, how fears, how stress, and how famines, poverty, stuff like that all come together and merge into like something so powerful that it literally causes hysteria events. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed it. I hope it was interesting. I had a lot of fun like researching about this. I had done previous research on this topic, and there was something of people just stepping into the city and just dancing that, like, I'm not gonna lie, it kind of scared me a little bit. Like, I remember I was looking, I was looking for movies and documentaries. I found one that's called Strasbourg 1518. I think it's just that, Strasbourg 1518. And the trailer, guys, the trailer literally spooked the shit out of me, because it's just like people randomly dancing, and like the type of movements, the type of like jerking movements, sporadic and erratic movements and stuff like that. That's that's pretty spooky, guys. That's a little bit scary. So that's that. There's a new channel that I wanted to make that is just like specifically focused on these like small documentaries, on these small essays of like events and stuff that I find interesting. It's gonna probably lean towards um creepy, weird horror events and stuff like that, but I might touch on some topics that I find interesting or like funny. So yeah, if you like that type of stuff, follow along, guys. Anyway, bye.